Would the congregation please stand? Turn it over to your family.
Good morning, everyone. For those who may not remember, I'm Roscoe Parker, Jimmie's oldest son, and we are here today to pay our last respects to Commander Jimmie Parker. He's the father to several of us, grandfather, husband, friend, and cousin, and we've enjoyed many years with him. Today, I'm going to talk for a few minutes. My brother David Parker, the middle son, will speak for a few minutes. Then Preston Parker, my youngest brother, will come up. And then David will come back up again. He has some remarks that were given to him by David Searles, my father's cousin, who sadly could not be here today, but is with us in spirit. I thought a long time about what I would say, and it's still difficult. My earliest memories of my father were when we were living in Whidbey Island, and it was just before my brother David was born. And my father was kind but gruff. He was demanding but understanding. He was skilled and could be very gentle. He very strongly supported his family. When I was a young child, we traveled all over the world as part of his Navy career. David, I think, is going to talk a little bit about some of the time frames and places we were, things we did. But I just want to give you some impressions from my side. We moved around quite a bit, and so the core for us was our family. We never, my brothers and I, we never really had friends for more than a couple of years at a time. So the core was our family, and we stuck very tightly together when we were children. My father, as everybody knows, was a career naval officer, and he was not a warrior, but he was a proud naval officer. And that's something that I've always been proud of too. I will never forget one time when I was on base with him doing some shopping. He was wearing his uniform, and I was so proud to walk next to him. In order to further his career, he decided that he needed to be in a combat zone. So he volunteered to go to Vietnam. And he did 2 tours in Vietnam. He was a supply corps officer, supposedly in the rear with the gear, as they say. But something he didn't expect was he walked into the middle of a hot war. He saw things that people shouldn't see. He saw things that people shouldn't see. He experienced things that people shouldn't experience. And that was to have a very profound effect on his life. We really didn't know then what PTSD was. People knew shell shock, combat fatigue, who were frontline soldiers. He was not one of those, so he was not supposed to suffer. He did. He brought that back from Vietnam with him and carried it the rest of his life. It definitely had some profound effects on our family. It was one of the contributors to the breakup of my father's marriage with my mother, along with the tumultuous times that we lived in. The Cold War, all of the things that affected us all for decades. And my father did the best that he could with the circumstances that he was given. Unfortunately, my parents' marriage ended. The family broke up for a while. Some of you know that I was estranged from my father for more than a decade because of all of that. But something happened, and in the early 90s, I had moved from North Virginia down here to North Carolina, and he reached out to me and made it clear that he wanted to repair things between us, and he did. And that is also something that I'm very proud of him for doing. He ended up meeting and marrying Jane Lucky, which was a great thing for our family. Jane became the center of our family, organizer, advisor, grandmother not only to her children's children, but to ours as well. My daughter Ava loves her just without reservation. And Jane was able to make it so a grumpy old man could be a good grandfather to my daughter. So that's something that none of us will ever forget. Jane also organized a reconciliation between my father and my mother, and she became part of the family once again. So I congratulate Jane for doing that, but I also have to say that my father was willing to do this, and it was very appropriate to do so. One of the things that is meaningful to me is that Jane and my father were at my mother's side when she died, and I don't think that she would have wanted anyone else there but Jane and my father. So here we are now. My father, I think in many ways, even with his struggles, was a fortunate man. He loved and was loved. And outside of his work and his obligations, he pretty much did whatever he wanted, when he wanted, how he wanted, all the way up to the very end of his life. And that's something that I think is a gift miss him terribly. David, would you like to come up?
I believe the proper introduction would be welcome aboard. Thanks for coming. I, like Russ, struggle to try and figure out what to say. I figured the best thing was, let's talk about the facts. Dad was born September 12, 1935, in a house here in Johnson County that I've actually stood in the yard and looked at. They chased me away, which was entertaining. In a house with no electricity, no running water. He was a tiny baby. The lady who bore him into this world told me when I was 10 or 12 years old a great story of my dad being born in mid-September, being a tiny little baby. Back then they believed that when you had a child, you should stay home and keep the child in quarantine from the world for at least a month. And Nellie Parker wouldn't do that. She ended up in Benson with my dad as a little baby and ran into the town doctor. And I am mad at myself because I cannot remember the town doctor's name, but she knew it. And the town doctor looked at her and said, "Nellie Parker, whose baby is that?" She said, "That's mine." And he said, "Let me see it." You know, typical doctor, looked the kid over, made sure he had all the right things in the right places. And the town doctor said to my grandmother, "Nellie, you shouldn't get attached to that baby because that baby's very tiny and probably isn't going to survive the winter." And that's the wrong thing to say to my grandmother, which makes me laugh even to this day. She took my dad home to the house with no electricity, no running water, and built an incubator out of bricks. And he spent all of his first 6 months sleeping in this incubator, which got him through the winter. That's how he survived. The best part of the story was the following April, once again, here in Benson, Nellie walking around with my dad. It's at that point probably 7 or 8 months old. And the same town doctor saw her and said, "Nellie Parker, whose baby is that?" And she looked at him and said, "That's my baby. That's the baby you said wouldn't survive the winter." And the town doctor was duly chastened, for lack of a better way to put it. Which again, that's one of those stories that makes me chuckle. I spent some time going through my dad's papers and looking at his high school yearbook. My dad graduated from Eastern High School in Washington, D.C. in the class of 1954. The first thing I figured out in looking in the yearbook was Eastern High School in 1954 was an all-white school. There were, in the senior section of his high school yearbook, there was class brags, and I love looking at it because every student's home address was listed in the yearbook. They lived, my father and his family at that time lived at 27 16th Street Northeast in Washington, D.C., which, you know, the horror of having people know where you live now, they didn't even think about that back then. The class brags went on to say that he was a student coaching award winner 3 times. He was on the projection crew all 4 years, which he told me when I was a kid that was a great way for him to go to school and go to sleep. because he could go sit in the projection room, get a movie running, and go to sleep. And get credit for the class. And it also said that he was a whiz on roller skates. My father finished school, went on to the University of Maryland, got a Bachelor's of Arts degree in June of 1958. Sometime, and I can't find the exact date, but sometime in the late 59, early 1960, he went into officer candidate school with the U.S. Navy, graduated from the Navy Supply Corps School in 1963, graduated from George Washington University with a master's degree in international affairs in September of 1973, graduated from the Naval Postgraduate School with a master's degree in management in March of 1977. He was a commander in the Supply Corps in the United States Navy. He earned a National Defense Medal, an Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, a Vietnam Service with 5 Campaign Stars Medal, a Vietnam Campaign Medal, a Meritorious Service Medal, a Navy Commendation Medal, a Navy Unit Commendation, a Defense Meritorious Service Medal. He has a letter of commendation from the West German government awarding him a Cross of Merit First Class, which is actually one of their very highest honors for their military people, which was awarded to him by the West German government in 1973. He could not accept that medal because it was from a foreign government, and he was a U.S. Navy officer. He does have a plaque commemorating that. And the other one, and I love this, there was a service in the public interest meritorious letter from Director William H. Webster of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, dated January 30th, 1981. It doesn't say what it's for.
I can tell you.
Yeah, I'm sure. He retired February 1, 1981 from the United States Navy.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Preston?
So, as David said, my dad was born in 1935, and, this was the height of the Depression in this country. And he was born into, a world and a generation that, quite honestly, a lot of people don't know a lot about. We all know about what's called the greatest generation, the generation that fought World War II. But it was the next generation, the silent generation, as they were called, which are sort of unsung in this country. These were people who were too young to fight in World War II, but then did go on to fight in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, as David talked about. They're the ones that built the U.S. economy into the strength and the powerhouse that it is today. They were loyal, hardworking, patriotic, and suspicious of change. They didn't like fast change. And I always thought, when you look up the definition of the silent generation and its characteristics, like you'd see a picture of my dad, because that was him. Fiercely patriotic, didn't like change, liked it his way. And those are the characteristics that defined his life. So my brothers have always said that I grew up in a very different family than they did. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I had a very different relationship with both of my parents, but it's especially prevalent with my dad. It was just a very different relationship. My brothers talked about, when my parents broke up. I was 3 years old at the time. So I sort of grew up like this. It was just the way it was in my mind. So I have very few memories of my dad before, when my parents were still together, but I have countless ones after that. And, you know, I've come to view the time, you know, leading up to their divorce as a very tumultuous time in his life. As, you know, Russ explained, you know, the horror that he faced in being in war. And I just thought that was a tumultuous time. My memories of my dad were formed, you know, after my parents divorced. And, you know, it's what I would characterize as sort of the quiet period in his life. During that time, he had remarried. He remarried Janet. And that's when I would spend weekends with him. We did all kinds of different things, and one of my favorite things to do was to ride on the Washington Metro, which was actually pretty new at the time, in the early 80s. And I loved trains as a little kid, so we would sit in the front of the Metro train, and I'd just like peer through the window and watch the tunnel, which sounds silly. But my dad loved it because he was, as you guys probably know, notoriously cheap. And we would get on the Metro at Clarendon Station in Arlington, and we, you know, punch our fare cards, and we get on the train, and we would ride the train all day long and hit every stop within the network, and then come right back to Clarendon Station, and it was as if we'd never left. So he never had to pay anything for us to ride around the Metro all day. So the other thing that I would do is I would like to, you know, make up names of the stations. So there's one station called Foggy Bottom, and I always love to change the names. And I called that Doggy Bottom, and I thought that was absolutely hilarious. And he encouraged me to make up silly names for all the stations. But we would take trips. It included trips down here to the farm to see Grandma. I'd play outside during the day and help my dad with things, you know, projects he was working on. And at night, of course, you know, he and Nellie would sit around and, you know, drink bourbon and smoke cigarettes and fill that little house up with so much smoke that I had to sleep on the floor to escape the haze. I'll never forget my eyes burning. When he bought his cabin in West Virginia, I would go up there with him and work on his projects. And as I got older and stronger, he involved me more and more. And I remember at one point he was building decks around, and he asked me to help him, and he gave me the task of digging all the post holes. Well, as David knows very well, whenever you're digging post holes in West Virginia, you're running into rocks. So I would just clang, and Dad would just sit there and laugh his ass off because he thought it was so funny that I just would not learn. Climbing. So he enjoyed that. As I became a teenager, you know, as often happens with teenage boys, I got into my own world, and I saw my dad less and less. And he later told me that, you know, this made him sad, but he always knew that I would come back to him after I'd gone through my teenage years, and he ended up being right about that. One characteristic of my dad that always impressed me was, and I tried to emulate, is the notion of keeping your word and doing what you say you will do. If my dad said he was going to do something, you could 100% guarantee that it would be done. And you know, he always explained to me that this is a Parker characteristic, as he said. And he said, if Parker tells you that something is going to get done, you can guarantee it will. And I've tried to follow that as well. I never saw my dad show much vulnerability until Janet died in 1995. And, you know, Dad always seemed so stoic and strong, and to use Russ's words, grumpy. But I really saw the vulnerability in him when that happened. He was severely saddened by her death, and, you know, he actually needed me at that time, and I spent a lot of time with him then. But I couldn't have been happier when he was pulled out of that by meeting Jimmie. And he was introduced to her, and it was like there was this rebirth in him, and sort of his zest for life came back. So I always viewed that as the happy point in, you know, time in his life, you know, from the time he met and married Jimmie. You know, he had the tumultuous times, he had the quiet period, but then he got into the happy period. By this time, he was beginning to wind down his career after the Navy and really focusing on things he liked to do. Like Russell said, like, he got to do what he wanted. And he loved to do, you know, work on projects and build things. And, you know, during this time, he got to spend time traveling with Jane and eventually building the house at the farm, which we all know he always wanted to do that, and I'm thankful that Jane pushed him to do that. During this time, I also lived with Dad and Jane after I graduated from college. And it was at this time that I really came back to my dad, and he became not only my father, but my friend as well. And I also realized around this time how much my dad cared for me. I remember there was one weekend I went back to Virginia Tech to go see a football game in Blacksburg, and after the football game I was driving down here to the farm. And on the way, it's a long drive, and I got really tired because I was driving at night, and I actually ended up stopping in Cary, where Russell lived, just because I couldn't drive any farther. And so I slept at Russell's that night, and it was late, so I didn't call Dad and Jane to tell them that I wouldn't be there. Well, the next morning, when Dad got up and found I wasn't in the house, he had called every state trooper post from here to Blacksburg to find out where his little boy was. And then finally he called Russ and discovered I was sleeping in Russ's house. But it made me realize how much my dad cared for me, and how Jane told me how upset he was that I wasn't there in the morning when he woke up. This was the happy part of his life, as my brother said. I was impressed that he was able to reopen the most difficult part of his life, the divorce. That takes a lot of patience and courage to revisit something like that. And I was always so proud of him for doing that. Eventually I met Erin and introduced her to Dad and Jane. We spent time with them on trips, going to St. Martin, coming down here to the farm for long weekends. And, I saw that how happy Dad was in his life, and he was happy that his boys had found their place in the world, and that their families had grown. And as he got older, he certainly became more set in his ways. But he liked things the way he liked them. And though his death came unexpectedly, I would say it met a number of his criteria. You all knew that, he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he was starting to experience the symptoms of that. He didn't want to lose his mind before he died. He was very afraid of that. He didn't want to outlive Jane. He was very frightened to see Jane die before him. He didn't want to be in pain, and he didn't want to be alone. So none of those things happened. I think he would say that it was a good death because he hit all those criteria. And though I'm deeply saddened and I'll miss my father a great deal, I do take solace in knowing that he had a long, interesting, and ultimately happy life. And I'd be lucky to experience the same. And I love you, Dad, and I'll miss you.
Thanks, Preston. And now we're going to have Dave read from some remarks from David Searles.
I had communicated with David Searles while we were planning this, and David has bladder cancer, he told me that he was pretty sure he wasn't going to be able to make it, and we had asked him if he would be willing to speak, and he was overjoyed at the offer. So the caveat is these are his words, not mine. It is with great sorrow, but an honor to be able to speak here today. There are a lot of things I remember about Jimmie. I guess one thing I always heard about Jimmie was how good of a skater he was. He and his partner won lots of competitions. When I was about 12 years old, Mama, Daddy, W.A., and myself went to Aunt Nellie and Uncle Hubert's in Washington. I guess this was about 1960. After dinner one night, supper for us Southerners, Gaynell and Jimmie had a few drinks and got to talking politics. Gaynell was in favor of Congress, the president, and courts to be in charge. Jimmie thought the military should be more in charge of making decisions. This went on for hours, and to a 12-year-old boy, it got funny as time went along. You can imagine that it probably did. Jimmie was a Navy man and proud of it. I never heard him talk a lot about his time in the service. I do remember him talking about basic training. He said that it was at the Great Lakes Training Center. He said it was in the winter when he was there. He was taken out in the lake with the other Navy guys and dropped off. He said he had never been so cold, but he made it and survived. He said some of the guys caught pneumonia. If you were never in the military, you don't realize what your military goes through. I know Jimmie was in Vietnam, but I never heard him talk about it. I do know that everyone that was there came back a changed person. Some not changed so much, but some were a different person, hooked on drugs or other things. When Jimmie and I were in the service, we did not have the means of communication that we do now. I know my only communication was old-fashioned snail mail. By the time you found out something from back home, it was over, good or bad. So everyone should not forget what your military has done and is doing for you each day. Say thank you to your military people and the veterans. I do like one thing, he printed this in a very large type, which is great. One thing I will always remember about Jimmie and admire was his carpenter skills. I remember going to his house, and he had built a cabinet for his boys' train set. You would open it up, and the train tracks were set up along with villages, lights, and everything to do with the trains. This was a boy's dream, and a dad's dream, too. Look at the home now with the things he enjoys and the things that he built for everyone to enjoy. It is truly a spectacle. Each year we have a family reunion, and Jimmie always had something special. One year he had Russell and his friends skydive into the field at his house. I do remember that. There was a bounce house for the children. He had a tent set up where a lot of stuff got told. Probably a lot of lies. We even had a woman tell that she could look at a man walk and tell if he was worth a darn. Needless to say, all the men stayed seated when she was around. The last one he had, he told me that was the last one for him, that the boys would have to take over because he was fixing to be 80 on his next birthday. Something I will remember about Jimmie is that barefoot smile. You know when you see if they are up to something or fixing to tell a good one because of that smile. Jimmie asked to speak at my mother's funeral. He was telling about how good Mama was, and he didn't know how she did all of it with her hell-raising brothers. The preacher said something to him and got upset. He did ask me if what he said upset the family or hurt Mama. I told Jimmie there was no way he could say or do anything that would upset her and not to worry. Russell, David, and Preston, your dad loved you. He would always tell me what you were doing and how proud he was of you. Please remember that. In closing, we have a lot of good memories of Jimmie, but I know if he could say something to us now, he would say, life is short. Make things right with your Maker because we are not promised tomorrow. Thank you.
So I just have a couple more words. Then after that, I would offer that if anybody else wants to come up and share, they're more than welcome to. But I just wanted to share a few things. So, you know, we talked about my father's strength, his patriotism, his seriousness, his commitments, things like that. But there was another side to him as well. And I'll just share one or two things. When we were living in Germany, my father had taken a 6-week intensive course in the German language, and it was useless. I mean, I think he learned 3 words. He never adapted to the German language at all. And so for him, being the leader of the family, being in Germany was a challenge. You know, his boys just thought it was a big adventure. His wife, she really loved it there, but for him, it was a challenge. But he made up for it. So he lived in a complex run by the U.S. State Department in Germany, and filled with apartment buildings, multi-story apartment buildings. One year for Christmas, my father managed to find a truckload of plywood somewhere. And he spent several weeks building this gigantic plywood star. And if I recall, it was about from here to here and about that tall. He ringed it with Christmas lights and then climbed up on the top of the building, set up a makeshift winch, and winched it up and attached it to the side of our apartment building, plugged it in for Christmas, and left it there for weeks. It could be seen for miles. and I don't know what the Germans thought of it. I'm sure they thought, well, there's those crazy Americans in their compound again. I know what the other Americans thought of it. They thought it was pretty nuts too, and he just thought it was hilarious. He just walked around with a big grin on his face for the entire Christmas period because he had done that. And you know, so there were things like that through his life where he displayed a very kind of a cheeky air that goes sort of against the proud naval officer thing that we all know about him. And I think it's important for all of us to remember, though, that he had that side to him as well. And he could be really funny to be around. And he also was, he was there for many of the important things for us. He was at all of our weddings. He was typically the first one there when our children were born. My daughter was held by him first family member held my daughter, and I'm going to never forget that. He really was quite the man. So if there's anybody who would like to say anything, and if you don't, that's fine too. Okay. Well, we are now going to adjourn to the graveside, and look forward to seeing you over there. Thank you very much for coming.
Be careful getting down those stairs. Or when you pay the rent, you're welcome to do that. Good seeing both of you men today. Hector, you can go out this way. It's perfectly fine. I'm doing good. Ronnie, I'll turn it over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me have your attention just a moment, please. You need to prepare yourselves for a 3-shot volley performed by the Vietnam veterans of Johnson County. Following the 3-shot volley will be the folding and presentation of the American flag. The military part of the service will conclude by the rendering of taps. We respectfully request that you be very reverent during this particular time, which will allow us to properly honor a fallen American hero. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your cooperation. First empty cartridge represents duty. The second empty cartridge represents honor. The third empty cartridge represents country.